And then I ran into a little guy by the name of George Knudson out of Canada. And I watched him hit the golf ball. I watched him with the wide stance, taking the club back way inside, releasing the club. One of the greatest ball strikers I'd ever seen.
One of the great ball strikers in my mind that I have seen ever play the game.
I can tell you that George Knudson is one of the finest ball strikers ever.
We don't have players like that on the tour anymore. We don't have the artists like George that could really maneuver the ball, and I think the world of golf needs more George Knudson.
I developed an attitude just when I was very young, probably 13 years old. I played my first junior tournament. That was the first time I played in front of any people. And my feeling was that, my God, if they're here watching me, I must have something I want to see. And so that kind of put me at ease, and I've had that attitude ever since.
I'm not shocked at all or surprised when I go out and ran out the ball against the hole time and time again.
George Knudson, Canadian golfer, 8-time winner on the PGA Tour. He came second in the Masters in 1969. One of the most stylish and debonair people that you will have ever seen play the game of golf. He swung the club majestically, and he had some equally fascinating views on the way it should be swung. We sat down with Lorne Rubenstein, who is possibly one of the most decorated golf writers, journalists and authors in the modern era. So Lorne knew George for a number of years, became very good friends, wrote the book, The Natural Golf Swing, with him, spent a huge amount of time with him, and brings George's life together in a wonderful way. It's a really good podcast, this. I know you guys are going to enjoy it, and without further ado, it's over to the pod.
Watch this.
Lorne, a huge welcome to this podcast. Lorne, you're a golf journalist and writer, written a huge number of books, have an unbelievable career as possibly one of the game's most decorated golf writers in the modern era, I guess. Very lucky to have you onto the podcast to talk about George today, so welcome.
Thank you, Sam.
I feel like it's sacrilege having you on this podcast and not spending ages talking to you about your career, because I feel like we could do so much on that. But I wanted to keep this podcast about George, and hopefully this is not the last time you'll be joining us on the pod, and it won't be the last time we get to speak. But I want to kind of kick this off with a question, Lorne, if it's okay. George Knudson. A number of people listening to this podcast might not have ever heard of him or might know very little. How would you best summarize him to somebody who's never heard of George Knudson?
Well, whenever conversations come up about golfers who could master what I consider the two most elemental aspects of the game, which is controlling the flight of the ball and hitting the kinds of shots that you want to, George's name comes up there all of the time. I mean, it doesn't matter with older players or younger players who study a little bit of the history of the game. His name is right there. You know, really from Lee Trevino to the younger players today who study, as I say, the history of the game and are interested in the golf swing and simplifying it. And his name comes up. Now, he only played once, as far as I remember, in the UK, so it's not surprising that people don't know him too well over there. He played in an event at Birkdale, at Royal Birkdale. But he played, other than that, he played in Australia and Japan, and obviously the PGA Tour, and in Canada. And so he developed a wide reputation for controlling the ball, as I say, and for playing it in kind of an almost a cool, casual way, the way he dressed, the way he walked, slowly. Back in those days, the cigarette, hanging out of his mouth, like as with Hogan. And he got to know Hogan. They played some golf together down in Seminole before the Masters a fair amount. And Hogan had a lot of respect for him. As a matter of fact, whenever George got to a practice tee before a tournament, and if Hogan was on the range, on the tee, a spot just automatically opened up beside Ben Hogan, as players knew that Hogan would want George there. And the two of them, they might not say a word to each other. They'd just be hitting balls back and forth like a symphony of balls tracing the sky and hitting shots they wanted to hit. So he's kind of the golfer's golfer. And it's not like he didn't win. He won 8 times on the PGA Tour, and he finished second in the Masters. So it's not just that he was an artist and a scientist of the game. He could put it to practice at the highest levels.
Yeah, and you touched on it straight there. Anyone that does a little bit of light research about George Knudson will quickly stumble across references to Hogan. He was almost a disciple of Hogan, right? He was kind of in awe of him from quite a young age. Is that fair to say?
Yes, you can imagine George, who grew up in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is one of our colder cities in Canada. My dad's family's actually from there, so I have a soft spot towards Winnipeg. But he grew up caddying at a local very good course called St. Charles, and then he went off to the U.S. to find Hogan. And he went down to California, and he saw Hogan playing, I think, in what was called the Crosby then, now the Pebble Beach Pro-Am, the AT&T. And he just followed him. He was like a musician going to study, a jazz musician going to study, let's say, John Coltrane or Miles Davis. I have to see them in concert. And he wanted to see Hogan in concert. And Hogan's stage was on the tour. And George followed him, watched him, and eventually got to know him and playing together, as I say. So he was a Hogan disciple. And even Hogan, at one point, said he looks, or people said he swings more like Hogan than Hogan himself. So George made no bones about it. He wanted to study Hogan. He liked everything about him. His quiet, intense demeanor, his ability to hit golf shots, all kinds of golf shots. And they did spend a lot of time together. And George studied him. Hogan wasn't the only player he studied in that day. He studied Julius Boros, and he studied Tom Weisstoff, who was a contemporary of his. So he was very much into examining what these players had in common, and came up with his own analysis, and then simplified it in a way that he could take it to the golf course and to tournaments, and later on in his teaching did the same.
Yeah, and you've spent quite a lot of time with George, haven't you? And obviously, he kind of died far too young, really, at the age of 51 in, I think, was it 1989? When did you first come across him, and then when did you first sort of start to develop a bit of a relationship with him? Because you wrote the book together, towards the end of his life. You have a lot of fondness for each other. You were very good friends. When did you sort of talk to me about how you got to know George and kind of develop a bit of a relationship there?
Well, I was aware of him certainly when I was 13, 14, 15 years old, growing up in Toronto, and Knudson George lived in Toronto as well. So I became aware of his prowess on the golf course. And then it's funny because at one point, I don't know, I was 17 or 18 years old. I wrote him. There was no email, of course, or anything like that. I wrote him and asked if I could caddy for him at a tournament. And I never heard back from him. So I thought, well, that was too bad. But a little bit later, I got to know him. He as his playing career sort of wound down, he opened up a golf school in Toronto, and I made a point of getting to know him and visiting there. He also had some junior golf camps, you might say, at a club where I belong called the National Golf Club of Canada. And that's really where I first came to know him. Also, I was doing a master's in psychology at a university about 50 miles west of Toronto, and I did my minor paper. I did a paper on the psychology of golf as it basically connected to the golf swing. Now you have to have security in the golf swing and what you're doing to really be able to be calm on the golf course. And George was always into that. He always said that, you're fooling yourselves if you think you can be calm over the golf ball when you've got an important shot to hit, if you don't understand what you're trying to do. If you're absolutely just relying on timing and tempo and feel, something's going to go wrong. At least you have to have the internal feeling that you know what you're trying to do, even if you don't always do it, obviously. And it was around then at the National when he was teaching there that, and I was doing this degree at the University of Guelph, a sports psychologist, actually a psychologist who has since passed away. And we both got to know George and spent some time with him and worked with him. And that's when also I was editing the Canadian Golf magazine Score at the time. And George was a contributing editor. I got him to write a number of instruction articles, and he was very involved in that. Very careful with what he wrote, wanted every word to be crystal clear and every word sentence to relate to the next, so there wouldn't be any confusion in anybody's mind reading it. And it was really there around, the early to mid 70s when I got to know him and spent time with him, and it just continued until his death, as you say, too early.
I guess it was fascinating, wasn't it, Lorne, to talk to him about that, because when you look at the pictures of George, and he has this unbelievable style about him, like he's just the coolest guy you've ever seen holding a golf club, and you could maybe think, he's just a bit of a cool dude, perhaps. But when you then sort of listen to quotes and you sort of watch interviews with him, you immediately tell that he's like incredibly thoughtful and intense about the golf swing and his own sort of view as to how to swing the club. And he's quoted quite heavily as saying that gain control, you've got to give up control.
Mm-hmm.
And what was that like, sort of listening to him talking about the golf swing? Because I think even today those thoughts, maybe George as a player is a type of player that we don't see enough of. He was really someone that you would say is a lot more artistic, someone who was more creative, versus perhaps some of the more cookie cutter style of golfers that we see now, where it's about launch angles, ball speed, club head speed, all of that sort of stuff. Did it feel really refreshing and different the way he looked at the swing and the game of golf back then? Or is that maybe just the benefit of sort of 50 years history?
No, I always enjoyed being with him because I always looked at golf as an art form. I really did. I mean, it was science as well. I understood that. And I mean, Hogan wrote his book, The Modern Fundamentals. I was reading a lot about the golf swing, at the time. But when George and I talked, I really felt like I was talking, as I said before, in a studio. He was a master, an artist in the golf practice area and the golf course and tournament golf. They were his studios. So that's how I felt when I was with him. I was sitting or standing, as the case may be, at the feet or hands of a master. And he didn't speak a lot. He was quiet like Hogan. But when he did speak, you listened, because he wasn't just going to talk and talk and talk. As a matter of fact, when we started doing the book, he said, Lorne, I could write this book on a matchbook. That's all the space I need. I said, George, I don't think the publisher would want a matchbook. They need a book with a few pages on it between the covers. But that's the extent to which he had simplified it, he thought. And when I talked to him, I always came away, you used the word refreshed, and that's exactly the appropriate word, Sam, because I came away refreshed. He kind of cleared up a lot of the confusion that I might have had about the golf swing, that I did have about the golf swing, and he cleared up what the game was all about. It was about moving the ball from point A to point B in an artistic way and hitting the shot with the kind of trajectory that you wanted. So it was really a beautiful thing to talk to him, and his ability, he was a minimalist of the golf swing and a minimalist of speaking about it. And that's the way he spoke about, his life as well. His three boys, his three sons, his wife Shirley. When he talked, he talked in a very condensed but warm way. Now, there's no doubt that, on the tour, he had his difficulties with, I would call it, being away from his family, with the public side of the game. When his kids, the three boys, got old enough to go to school, he found that difficult. In the era when you had to pay for long-distance phone calls, he rang up quite a bill every month calling home. So that was hard on him, and that's part of why he left the game early. It was just getting too difficult for him to be on the road emotionally and spiritually and that sort of a thing. And so he turned to teaching, and he found he enjoyed that.
Yeah, because you see that he sort of retired sort of quite early from the tour, didn't he? And I want to come back and talk a little bit about his, some of the wins and his performances as a professional. But when you look at that swing, and like you say, it's minimalist, isn't it? It's quite hard to, and this is where your skill as a golf writer comes in, but to really bring to life the beauty of the swing that he had. Like, it's quite a unique takeaway. It's very flat on the inside, isn't it? And there doesn't seem to be there's not much going on. It's minimalistic, but there is an absolute undeniable beauty to the way he swung the club. How would you kind of bring that to life for us a little bit?
It was like, I would liken it to, not that I've watched that much, ballet or something. I thought of him hitting a golf ball was like, I need to talk about that as a dance. He talks, in our book about talking to a young woman, a girl really in Halifax, Nova Scotia, who was a dancer. And he wanted to talk about the golf swing and how she saw the golf swing as a dance, moving from the start position back to the top of the swing and through to the finish position. And that really is how he saw it, that it was a matter of a stripped down move with just the essential weight transfer back and through. So to talk to him about it was to really get a sense of that. And, he had studied, when he was younger, he was certainly interested in all of the ways golf was taught. He was interested in all of the different moves, but he found it didn't help them, and it didn't help too many others as well. And that's why he worked hard to strip it down. And he was hard on himself too. And in our book, he would call up, he was so into it, he would call me up sometimes at 11 at night and say something like, Lorne, in chapter 3 on page 14, I think I want to use a different word or a different phrase. I'm not quite happy with that. He was a perfectionist, and he was a perfectionist in the golf swing as well. He would say things like, when he's out on tour, I can't imagine how any of my fellow players, competitors, can go out there and not be secure in what they're trying to do, and just depending on, their feeling from one swing to the next. So, he said he only hit one perfect shot in his life in Japan, the 5-iron to an elevated green that came off the face. Now imagine saying that, a tour player. But that's what he thought. He hit one perfect shot in his life. So it was really a joy to be around him. It was an education to be around him. And he cared about people. That's the thing. He really cared. Even for me, when I wrote my first article in the major magazine, I came home and there was a message on my answering machine. And I didn't know him that well. All he said was, just keep writing and good things will happen. So, that was a vote of encouragement from somebody, because, in my own little way, I was trying to, you might say, emulate his golf swing in my writing, just say what's important. And he taught me at a reasonably young age as a writer and as a golfer to really strip it down. Only the writer and only the golfer knows what they have taken out of what they're trying to do. The reader doesn't really know that. The reader will sense if you've put in too much, just like a golf swing can look very complicated. But as you so rightly said, his look just so boom. As you would say, if you start in a good position and you finish in a good position, not much can go wrong in between. So, there are certain things he said that never have left me.
Yeah, he's a thoughtful guy.
He really was.
Really, really sort of thoughtful. And to be that efficient with your words and everything. He was extremely diligent with the swing, wasn't he? Some of the stuff when you read about his days growing up and working at St. Charles Country Club and going out for 9, I think there's stories he would kind of, go back to the range. He'd hit a shot he didn't like. He'd just go back and work on his swing. Is it fair to say he was more in love with the process of swinging the club than maybe the external view of playing the game and scoring? Is that a fair assessment?
It is, Sam. Although I would say that he did feel that the ultimate examination of what he was thinking about the golf swing was on the golf course. During the tournament, but he would much rather hit balls, practice, think about it, take a few notes, talk to the person beside him about it, go in, have a beer, have something to eat, chat about it. So yeah, he did walk in off the golf course when he was playing with his friends. Sometimes he would say, I just didn't practice enough, I'm not ready, or I don't like the way I'm hitting it, I got to go work. So he wasn't all about score. He felt score was something you added up at the end, and if you hit all the right shots, well, your score would probably be pretty good. It would work out. So, the range was really, as I say, just studio, and that's where he practiced, that's where he thought. And also later on, when he would go into the clubhouse, and if there was a steam bath available, he would sit in that steam bath and think about the swing for, half an hour or so. He loved the steam bath. But he was really, you can't say he was old school because he was playing in the 60s, 70s, 80s. So, that was, compared to now, that's a long time ago, 50 years ago and more. And he hung out with some of the players that, he knew were really into the swing that he could talk to. That's what he wanted to do. And as I say, he was a perfectionist. But you're right, being on the range and hitting golf balls, hitting different shots, hitting the 9 different shots that he thought there were in golf, fade, draw, high, low, that sort of a thing was really what he wanted to do. It was really a concert out there when he was hitting golf ball. I could just sit there and watch him in the same way that he would sometimes sit, and just watch what Hogan did. Not, as I say, not a word would pass between them, but later on he got to know Hogan, and that was a relationship that persisted out of deep respect for one another.
You talked about life on the road and maybe not being, whether it's conducive to good family life. And I think, that's obviously still a problem that, professional golfers have today, right? But he has his first professional win, I think, in 61. He's on the road, traveling and playing a lot, obviously doing the full swings down, whether it's the West Coast or into Florida. What would that have looked like back in those days? Because obviously the money's not in the game to anywhere near the same extent. So private jets, bringing the family with you, kids being in school, what would that have looked like in terms of his travel itinerary? And that weighed quite heavily on him, you say? It
did. They would on a Sunday night or the Monday morning after the tournament, they would in those days, so if they could drive, they would drive. Obviously players flew as well, but George's habit was, if he would drive, and if his family was with him, they would drive in a caravan. He spoke about sort of the friendliness amongst the players. The caravan would stop, let's say, at a park, and they'd have a barbecue, and then they'd end up in the same motel, probably not even a hotel, but a motel at the side of the road. And it was just a traveling caravan going on to the next tournament. If they're going cross country, obviously 2,000-3,000 miles, then they would fly. But most of the time he wanted to drive. And there were times when his family couldn't be with him, as I say, when the kids started going to school, and it was lonely for him. And, he probably spent a little bit too much time in bars. There's no doubt about that. He was, he would drink to sort of assuage his loneliness. And there are stories of him showing up on the tee, even during a tournament where he was not quite in his best shape. But that's just, that was the difficulty he had. He handled the private side of the game very well, going out and just hitting golf balls and playing. But the public side of it and socializing and doing all that, he was okay with it. But it's not like he was a guy who was going to hang around parties all the time. He just wanted to be on his own or with his buddies. And if that led to a couple of too many vodkas, which was his drink, well, that was just the way it was. And he smoked heavily, which obviously was the end. It caused this lung cancer and eventually his death. But so, yeah, if he could have just stayed home and played a tournament in his backyard all of the time, it would have been much easier on him personally, if that wasn't the way it was. But getting on the road with his friends, he spoke often of the closeness of players out there, and that they would support each other's family, babysit, these kinds of things. I don't know if that goes on today. Most players are flying from place to place, they have they have the RVs that they have their homes in. That's another way of traveling the tour. But back then it was a group, and you had your own people that you kind of hung out with, and that was just the way it was with George.
Yeah, and today's player, okay, maybe not all the players, but they're going as a larger party, haven't they? They've obviously got their caddy, but they've got whether it's a nutritionist, a masseuse, a head coach, putting coach, short game coach, you name it. They've got a whole entourage around them. Whereas I suppose back then it was, they were like a sort of almost like a bit more of a traveling circus with friends and people that they would spend time with in the evenings. Who were his real close buddies? Do you know who the guys that he would stay up late drinking with and the people he'd confide in the most on tour?
Well, he had friends in Toronto who would sometimes go out there on tour with them, and, some of them are still around. I was talking to one the other day, and he happened to tell me a story. He said, "Did you hear this? He was a very close friend of George's." And I was on the back of a range here, and we ended up speaking. And of course, he told the George story. They were very, very close. His name is Paul Williams. And there were a lot of people like that. Gary Allis, who was passed away. So there were people off the tour that he was very close to, and that meant a lot to him because they were with him through thick and thin. Their friendships with him didn't depend on how he was doing on the golf course. And he had good relations with the media because they always knew he was good copy. He would talk to them. You know, he also would know what you might say the boundaries are in terms of he just wanted to practice. Okay, boys, it's my time. Let me practice here. And on tour, he was, you know, he had a few, I don't know if these were drinking buddies or whatever, but people who were into the golf swing that he hung up with. Rod Funseth was a very close friend of his back then. And you might remember Bert Yancey, who was really into the golf swing and the fundamentals of the golf swing. And he wrote some beautiful pieces on the evolution of the golf swing. And he would make, I think, plaster or clay models of Augusta National's greens before he would go play in the Masters. Yeah, you should look him up, Bert Yancey, a very interesting guy.
No way.
So George had those people, but certainly Rod Funseth, who died a number of years ago, was one of George's closest people. And he needed those people he could be with and confide in. They knew what he was all about. He knew what they were about. And, you know, he didn't try to pretend to socialize with people he didn't feel comfortable with. He knew that he had to have a quiet mind to play. And he didn't want it disturbed. He would drive slowly to golf tournaments, you know, instead of I'm going to walk down the fairways at my own pace and slowly. Then I don't want to get too speedy too early in the morning or in the afternoon before it's tea time. And he would drive slowly, you know, on the inside lane at the speed limit or slower to the golf course.
It's great advice, though. You know, you can look at, you know, I think there's something, you know, we watch players today like DJ and you watch him stalk around the course, you know, quite slowly. And it's quite, you know, it has a different feel to it. It sort of projects a feeling of control and being able to, you know, you're almost setting the pace, aren't you, to an extent? This isn't about playing slowly. This is about the mannerisms and the way you behave on the course, and being quiet, I think, was the way George put it. That's all part of the style. I mean, that was all a conscious thing, right?
That was who he was, yeah. He wasn't a slow player. He walked slowly, but when he got to the ball, he was ready to play. He was sizing it up before he got to the golf ball. And if you look at images of him, pictures of him, you know, you go on YouTube or whatever, you just see some tournaments. He's always in muted clothes. There's nothing that colorful about his clothes. Didn't want to draw too much attention to it himself, but he also didn't feel comfortable in those. He burned hot inside, but on the outside, you wouldn't know that. You know, he wore these quiet clothes, you know, solid colors, grays, always in a cardigan like Hogan and like Palmer early on, you know, tan slacks, let's say, or gray. And he just, that's just the way it was. As I say, the cigarette hanging out of his mouth and walking slowly to the ball. There's a great story of him playing at a tournament, I think it was called the Cajun Classic in Lafayette, Louisiana, in one of his early tournaments. And the particular hole, you drove over a ridge, so you couldn't see where your ball landed. He was playing with Palmer and Billy Casper. They each hit their tee shots. Palmer was, as you know, going at it as hard as possible and finishing up at the top of the swing looking like an octopus. But, you know, it was so efficient and effective for him. Billy Casper setting up, you know, to hit a hook and hitting his hooks down there and then the ball rolling out. Then George kind of quietly going up to the ball, putting his tee in the ground, looking down the fairway, and then just making his smooth swing. Anyway, the three of them, they each hit a good drive, but they didn't know where the ball finished over the brow of the hill. They walked down there, and from a distance, you could see three balls in a row, almost in a line, like the stars in the night sky sometimes. And George, instead of stopping at the first ball to look if it was his, kept walking. He didn't stop at the second ball to see if that was his. He went right to the third ball, knowing that he outdriven both Palmer and Casper because he saw the golf balls come off the face. He knew how well he had hit it. He just walked up to his ball, stood to the side, folded his arms across his chest, and looked back at Palmer and Casper as if to say, well, I got you this time, boys.
And he just knew it as well. You know, he's a master craftsman in his own right. So he just, like you say, the having that level of knowledge and understanding as well, where it's like he knew the answers before they did. I think it's unbelievable.
Well, he felt the golf shot was over, like Tiger in the state. He felt the golf shot was over before he hit it. Well, I've got everything planned. I know exactly what I'm trying to do. I can't hit a bad shot. So doesn't mean he didn't.
Completely assured in his long game, wasn't he? The smoking, I get the sense that he was quite, I don't know whether this is the right way to describe it, highly strung individual, very energetic, sort of, and maybe the smoking a little bit obviously has that, you know, slightly sedative effect to it? Do you think maybe there was a bit of the smoking being a bit of a crutch to remain calm? You said he runs hot internally. Was there the smoking was a bit of a crutch to sort of maintain a more of a sort of a chilled existence on the course?
Well, he knew he couldn't be like that all the time. I mean, you might burn hot on the outside, but to be that intense for 72 holes of tournament, you know, you had to find a way to calm yourself down. At least he felt that he did. Certainly to hit the golf ball properly and to contend in tournaments, to compete in tournaments. So the smoking was early on, I'd say, you know, a way to relieve his anxiety and somewhat of a crutch. You know, he knew that it was, and he knew that's why. He also knew he smoked too much, but he couldn't stop really. Now, I don't know if he really ever tried to stop, but he never succeeded if he did try. And the only time he succeeded was when he was diagnosed with lung cancer. He didn't blame anybody but himself. He smoked. He says, look, I smoked 3 packs a day for years. Who was I to think I wouldn't get lung cancer? But then he stopped immediately there. But it took that, unfortunately. That was too late. But yeah, it was something probably for a lot of people that he wanted to have something in his fingers, something to put in his mouth, something to walk down the fairway and flick aside. It was, you know, these were triggers. The trigger for him to smoke was anxiety and feeling, you know, kind of a little bit too hot on the outside. And the trigger for him to put it down and to flick it down onto the ground was, okay, time to hit a golf shot. Can't very well did it with a cigarette in my mouth. But, you know, it was definitely an anxiety alleviator, I would say.
Did some of the and this is one of the great things about someone who's revered around the world by the world's best players, has been possibly one of the greatest ball strikers to ever lift a club. Again, no mention of George Knudson is there without reference to his putting, and you know, he was regarded as a particularly weak putter. I think that's certainly sort of what comes through, that, you know, if he had, you know, half the putting game that maybe some of his peers had, he would have had an unbelievable career when it comes to, you know, victories and success.
Yeah.
Did he ever talk a lot about that? I know there's this brilliant exchange with Hogan where I think, does Hogan say to him something like, look, I don't mind you copying my long game, but please leave my putting alone. They both shared this complete disdain for putting, didn't they, really deep down? Did he ever talk much about putting?
Putting shouldn't count as a full stroke, that sort of thing. You know, but Hogan did say that, and he also said it in more colorful language, which I can't repeat here during the conversation.
You can.
During the conversation they had at Seminole at one time. But anyway, and Jack Nicklaus, of course, famously said that George Knudson had $1 million swing and a 10-cent putter. Now, having said that, George did win 8 times. You can't win 8 times. You don't win 8 times. You don't hit every shot like next to the hole. You still got to putt. But if you look at these videos on YouTube or whatever, he was very uncomfortable over the ball putting. First article I ever wrote for a major magazine was in 1979 called Psychology of the Swing, just in advance of the Canadian Open. I wrote a fair bit about George there. And I mentioned that he himself said this, when he was hitting the golf ball, he didn't see anything but his target, right? I mean, there might be, you know, I don't know, paper on the ground, pairing sheets that people threw, anything. He didn't see any of that. He just saw his target and flowing through the ball to go towards his target, because he always said golf was emotion. But on the putting green, he himself said that, you know, I would stand over a 10-foot putt, and he said I'd see little bits of discoloration in the grass. You know, I could see anything, and he was distracted. And then his putting stroke was more like a jab than anything else. It didn't look very good. Later on, as he got older, you know, into his 40s, and he wasn't playing anymore, he regretted that he didn't take putting more seriously. And he started to think about it more in terms of the way that he thought about the golf swing, as emotion, just threw the ball directed at the hole. But he could never get that when he was playing. So he won those tournaments without really putting that well. And even when he did make a putt, a 20-footer, it almost looked like, you know, it was kind of luck that it went in. But he didn't like putting. He really didn't. You know, he was the kind of guy who would, I remember Nick Price telling me about Bernard Langer, who's been amazing, of course. And but when they played together as young men, as young pros, Nick would say, you know, once we started walking towards the green, you could see Bernard's step and pace start slowing up, as if he didn't want to even get to the green. And he's conquered the yips 3 or 4 times, Langer. It's amazing, really. Now, I wouldn't say George ever had the yips. It's not like he got to, but it did look like a jab. It looked like a stab. And he didn't think, you know, the putting stroke was long enough to have much of a sort of that you could really understand the mechanics about it. It was a little handsy. So, if he had lived longer and played on the senior tour, the Champions Tour, he was getting into studying it and thinking about it using some of the same language and approach to the full swing. But, it was too late. It's too bad he didn't do that earlier. But that's how enamored he was with the golf swing itself.
It's hard, though, isn't it? I mean, I can only identify this through the lens of my own golf, but it's hard to make yourself work on the things that make you really, really uncomfortable. And it's really easy to work on the things that you adore. And that might be, full shots. That might be, pitch shots, things that you particularly enjoy. But, I find it hard to work on the things that make me absolutely terrified out on the course. And it's actually what we probably all should do. But, Lang is a great example. I mean, look at the wins in the career, particularly as a senior that Lang has had and how competitive he is. And it's easy to forget that, I'd have been very young at the time, but yeah, Lang had, chronic issues with the putter, didn't he? Absolutely chronic issues for a number of years.
He did, yeah. I mean, it's tribute to him that he's kind of gotten through the yips 3-4 times, I think, in his career using different methods. And here he is. He won on the Champions Tour again a couple of weeks ago. So he's so competitive. He's fit. I mean, George was fit as well. He knew that he couldn't, on the golf course, he couldn't play with that heat. And, when he went out and he won those 2 tournaments in a row in Arizona, I think it was in 68, he came back and he did have there was a place in Toronto called the Fitness Institute, founded by a guy named Lloyd Percival, who trained the Canadian Olympic hockey team. And he was probably one of the, earliest people really, really into fitness. And he did a lot of great work. I mean, and George got to work with him and started to work on it. And he went to him and he says, I'm so exhausted. And he had to come off the tour sometime. George said, I'm just too tired, emotionally, physically drained. I can't keep playing golf like this. So he worked with Percival. He had a series of exercises and drills and so on. And George put on about 20 or 30 pounds, really, so he could handle the grind and the rigors more. I mean, at home in Toronto, I have a file of the exercises that Lloyd Percival gave him. And they actually started when George was just getting up in bed. There were a series of maybe half a dozen exercises, stretches, and some leg movements and arm movements that he did before he even got out of bed. And he put on that weight and he got stronger, and he found that he could handle the rigors of tournament life and of travel better. But his constitution was not really suited to the kind of life that you had to have as a PGA Tour player, traveling around and playing in heat. And it was just hard on him, let's put it that way.
Yeah, the great players can compartmentalize, can't they, and reserve energy. And if you're burning at a high level of intensity for pretty much every waking moment, it must be quite hard. It's draining. You've got to be able to, it's very easy to sit there and look at, today's pros and say, well, they play 24 events a year and 4-day events. But actually, if you're burning at that level of intensity Monday through Wednesday, and you're traveling and you're constantly thinking about the game, and you're naturally someone who's intense, like, it will take its toll, I guess, in terms of your energy. His big sort of spell on tour is towards the end of the 60s, is that right? So just looking at some of his sort of big professional successes, 8 wins obviously throughout his career, second in the Masters in 69. George Archer won that year, I think. When he really got that together over those years, did he win the Phoenix and the Tucson back-to-back, I think, in 68 or something? He was on absolute fire. Was there anything that came together then, or did he just have a hot few weeks with a putter? What was it for George?
Well, those were the weeks where he just felt in tune with the golf course and with himself, and physically he felt strong after he put on that weight. And he would try to see himself. He would start the week, and if it worked out properly, he would sort of see himself through to not only the 72nd hole and think about what he wanted to do, but he would see himself through to a playoff. He actually thought through the whole tournament, okay, what happens if I get in the playoff? How do I have to feel then? And so he gave it a lot of thought, and that was difficult as well. That takes concentration. And he would isolate himself and just work hard towards the end of the tournament and just try and play right through. So that helped him not think about one shot. Everybody says play one shot at a time. George did that, but he knew that he had to put it behind him too, because he was such a perfectionist, and he was disappointed when he hit a bad shot because he felt he knew what he was doing. But in those weeks, he was able to kind of accept himself as a human being and put the shot behind it and really get so deeply into the next shot as a work of art, you might say. And his focus and his concentration was so good. And he'd come back to his room and he'd think about the round he played. He'd think about the next round. He'd think about where he wanted to be on Sunday and then through to a playoff if that happened. And he did get into a few playoffs. So I think it was just when everything was in tune. But he was such a sensitive guy in every way that I think when he wasn't emotionally in tune, physically in tune, he was just off and he couldn't play the golf he wanted to. Had he been able to be in that state of mind in more tournaments and more weeks, and he was always trying to find a balance. How often should I be out here? How often should I go home? What should I do? What am I going to do in the evenings? Coming back to the room alone, that sort of a thing. That wasn't, those weeks when he really got it together, I think early in the week he started playing well and he said, well, this could be one of those weeks. And he was so into it and so happy isn't the right word. He was so satisfied, so deeply satisfied in what he was doing that he just wanted to carry that right through. And he just stayed with it. It was like, riding a high performance vehicle for the whole tournament. And the high performance vehicle was himself. But, how often can you be playing at full speed? How often does it work out where every component is working? And those would have been the weeks probably when he wasn't three-putting 3 times around, that sort of a thing. He was getting it around. And he liked the golf courses, too. He was really a golfer who needed to feel in tune with the course. He tried to make himself like golf courses, but he couldn't force himself to like golf courses. He either liked it or he didn't. And he loved Augusta, but he never really handled those greens too well, which is why he finished second in that Masters in 69. And it was just those weeks when he was all in tune were the weeks that he could do well and perhaps win.
And then he you say he left the tour in, was it sort of mid-70s would it have been? When did he sort of stop playing on the major sort of PGA America, the US circuit? When was that? Because did it then roll almost straight into wanting to work on coaching, wanting to try to help more people? The book obviously came towards the end. How did the sort of post-professional career chapter sort of play out for George?
Yeah, I mean, once he got into the mid-70s and he was in his late 30s, he won his last tournament, I think it was in 72, in California, the Kaiser, as it was called then. I think that's right. But, he just had it. He just couldn't be out there anymore. It was taking too much out of him, even though he had not in better physical shape. And he started to realize that he enjoyed just simply talking to his friends about the golf swing and helping them. And that led into starting this golf school in Toronto, Buttonville, and then at the National Golf Club where I said, and he started that program. And there are people around now, juniors, well, they're not juniors anymore, but, fairly well-known instructors in the U.S. and elsewhere who were at that junior golf school that George taught. And they credit him with helping them get a kind of a good start and understanding the golf swing. And he really did enjoy it. He found, I remember one time he was teaching a fellow, and the guy went out and tried to do what George was teaching, instructing, and he didn't score very well. But he came back to George, and George said, "How'd you do?" He says, "Well, my score was really bad." George said, "Well, did you enjoy yourself?" And he said, "I've never enjoyed a round more because I felt secure in every shot I was trying to hit." So that was pure George too. He really did get a kick out of helping people. He answered people. I've got files and files of letters from people, who even before we wrote the book would write and say how much George helped them. And then after the book was published, I have a thick file of letters from people who felt that George really did simplify the game for them and help them understand it more and have more fun with it as they got older, because they weren't, as Gene Sersner once said, they weren't getting all fouled up in the mechanics of the swing.
Yeah, it was all back to sort of talking about those things that underpinned his success as a youngster, right? The balance, the simplicity of it, about it being a free-flowing motion rather than getting hung up on positions and all that sort of stuff that kind of constricts people.
He talked about what's voluntary and what's involuntary. What's voluntary is how you set up to the ball, your grip, your takeaway, and then it's just involuntary. Let it happen from then on through the finish. You finish solidly on your left foot. Said it took him a good year studying tour players, Hogan and others, Julius Boros, as I said, to notice that at the end of their swing, if they were a right-handed golfer, their left hand and left wrist were still as firm as they were at address. They hadn't collapsed or rotated or anything. And it took him a year to figure that out. So he was definitely analyzing what was going on out there. And it was only when he felt he had a complete understanding that he felt that he could write the book and that he could really be an effective instructor, which, he really was for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, you've been around the game, Lorne, for so long and, spent time with the best players that have ever played the game. You've written about them, you've watched them closely. How much of that stuff and the way that George approached the swing do you see in today's era? Do you see that it's become a little bit more positional focused and it's become a little bit mechanical rather than, or do you see that actually, the great players of today still kind of use those as the principles? I don't know. I mean, what's your sort of take on it?
Well, I think what's true is most players still think that, balance and rhythm are important. Granted, it's become very much a power grade, and, most of them use TrackMan, and, TrackMan is very effective in terms of telling you what you're doing during your swing and what the better players do in terms of the kinds of things that you mentioned: launch angle, spin rate, smash factor, carry. All of these things are important. You can see them on the range prior to a round with their TrackMan out there, and they're dialing in how much they're hitting. Let's say, how far am I hitting my wedge today? How far am I hitting my 8-iron? And TrackMan really helps with all that, and it's helping young kids come out with a very powerful swing. There are things that it's taught that I'm sure George never even thought about, even though he may have done them, probably had to do them. The idea of using the ground and catapulting through the swing, jumping up, that sort of a thing. So, it is more position-oriented right now. But I think when it comes right down to it on the closing stretches of a tournament, that it's still about motion. When you think, I don't know if you were watching Bay Hill recently.
Yeah, it was great last night, wasn't it? I mean, what a final round.
Yeah. And Kurt Kitayama on that last hole, you heard the dialogue between Kurt and his caddy when he drove it in the rough, and that was pretty thick rough at Bay Hill, and he had something like, I don't know, 180, 190 to the pin, but not 180 or 190 to where he wanted to hit it, the left side of the green. And, at that moment, he had to hit the ball pretty hard. He was using an 8-iron, and he had to be thinking just about his target. He was so focused on his target at the left side of the green because he didn't want to bring the water into play. So I can't imagine that at that moment he was thinking about position and mechanics. He was just thinking about, I've got to rip through this ball and get it on that left side of the green. So when it comes, and it's interesting to me that as players get into their 40s, let's say, more and more of them who've been through all of the mechanics and studied and probably played, well because of that. I heard Ernie Els say a couple of years ago, I'm trying to play more like a kid again. Well, what is playing more like a kid again? It means that discarding or setting aside and believing the mechanics and that you've internalized the mechanics already. Otherwise, you wouldn't be, on the PGA Tour at a high level, and just playing like a kid again, hitting shots. Yeah, you use yardages and specific yardages. You need to know that on the tour where the pins are tucked so close to the edges behind bunkers. But in general, they want to play more like a kid again. They want to get back to that freedom. I know with Mike Weir in Canada that, he went through a rough few years there in the mid-2000s, late 2000s, and now he's doing pretty well on the Champions Tour. And he got caught up in some of the mechanics of the swing too much. Because of an injury that he suffered along the way. And I think that happens to a lot of players. They struggle, but they come to a point and they say, okay, I'm here. I'm on the PGA Tour. I've won tournaments. Maybe I won a major or two. And now I'm just going to rely on myself and try to get back to playing like a kid again. I'll never forget when Ernie Els said that. That's one of the greatest players in the modern era. And he wants to get back to playing like when he was 15 years old.
But it's so right, isn't it? And I think, I might be wrong here, but, I think maybe Brad Faxon's done a bit of work with Rory on his putting, and he's sort of encouraged him to say, react to it. Think like you were when you were a junior, react to it on the greens. Don't get too hung up in everything else that's going on around in terms of process of analyzing the putt. Try and react to it, be more instinctive. And it was a brilliant exchange, last night. I know it's a slight digression here, but looking at Kitayama and the way he was kind of working with his caddy and looking at, how to just get himself into that right position. And like you say, you've just got to have an intent and try and put the freest flowing swing you can on that. It wouldn't have been beneficial. And I think, getting too hung up in the mechanics of the whole thing. I want to talk about, because you obviously wrote the book with George, how that worked in practice. Obviously, he got his lung cancer diagnosis, I think, through the process of writing that book as well as you were doing it. Just talk to me about that whole exercise, about how you try and take someone who's got, all this incredible thinking about the game of golf, is clearly so passionate, so intense, devoted a whole lifetime to the swing. How do you go about the process of almost trying to sort of distill that down into something that, I could pick up off the shelf and read and try and understand and put into practice in my own game?
Yeah, that was a great pleasure working with George on that book and distilling what we didn't have to distill much because he spoke so economically. But in terms of doing the book, it was 1987 in June, and we had just agreed to do the book. I don't even know if we had a signed contract yet with the publisher. But anyway, I went off to the U.S. Open at Olympic in San Francisco that week, and I came back, and there was a message on my answering machine long before phones or anything. And the message was simply, did you hear about George? I didn't know what they meant. But I quickly found out that in that week had been diagnosed with lung cancer. And we had really just barely started on the book. But we spoke, and he said, don't worry, we're going to get this book done. It's very important to me, and I want to get it done. And, prior to that, we had done some articles. As I say, he was doing some instructional articles for Score magazine. I was the editor of our national Canadian magazine in the early, when it started in 1980. By 89, I was no longer the editor, but George, the editor at the time, had been working with George to do some articles, and I helped George out with them. So we had a kind of a basis of, I knew what George was thinking. We'd spent a lot of time talking at his golf schools and talking for those instruction articles. So then the process was, I would go to George's house in North Toronto. He had a pool there. And I mean, the house was like, it was in a residential area in a suburb, but you almost felt like you were walking into kind of a private, quiet forest, because there were some, a lot of plantings around, and you'd walk through the house, which had a big sunken living room, wide open. You would never have expected George to live in a house that all of the rooms were small, and they weren't. You go into his house, there's the kitchen, and there's the big room, and you felt like you could breathe in this big room, and it looked right out onto the back and onto the pool and its landscaping, which was quite lovely in a simple way. And in warm weather, it was June of 87, on that summer and fall, we would sit by the pool and we would just talk. I'd make notes, I'd tape record, and then I'd put articles, or I'd put chapters together. I'd send them to George. He would write over them or make some corrections or put it in his own words. I still have in a file at home the long foolscap pages in his own writing, blind pages of this, in which he wrote a lot about the book, and he would he would change things where he felt it was better. He would suggest a word where he felt that was more appropriate. He would suggest 3 words if I used 6. So we did a lot of the book in that way at his house, but we also did it at a club in Toronto, which is hosting the Canadian Open this year, Oakdale. Golf and Country Club is the club that when George was 18 or 19 growing up in Winnipeg, a few members got together and brought George to Toronto, to Oakdale, to work as kind of an assistant pro there. But he didn't have any obligations there except to go out and hit golf balls and practice and play, because they knew what he had, that he had something special. And Oakdale was always very, very important to him. So, and he was grateful to Oakdale. So we would meet on the range and talk, and then we'd go inside, have some breakfast. As I say, it's kind of, he would enjoy the steam bath, go in there. That's where some of his best thinking was done. But those foolscap pages are treasures to me, really. I look through them sometime, and George had a very flowing script, handwriting, and anybody could read his pages because they're so clear. The letters, the individual letters are full. They don't jam into one another. They're not on top of one another. Every line is really clear to read. It's so amazing how every aspect of his life, this was important to him, kind of coalesced into a unified way of being. The openness in his house, the pool at the back, the vegetation, which, while very attractive, wasn't smothering. The way he liked to be on a range, have his own place out there. The way he liked to sit in a corner in the dining room there at Oakdale and have his breakfast or lunch. All of that. It was the way he walked down the fairway. He was one of the most, least, what would you say, scattered people that I knew. He knew what he liked. He tried to incorporate that into his way of life, and it fed into his golf swing and the way he approached his career. And, unfortunately, that also spoke to how much of a kind of a shy, introverted person he really was deep down. And therefore, he was lonely on tour and, drank and smoked too much. So, but it was all of a piece. It's hard to imagine changing one thing without changing his essence. Obviously, it would have been better if he didn't smoke, and if he could have, curbed the going out to a bar because he needed some companionship, or he needed, with his friends, or just couldn't sit in the motel room all the time. But other than that, I mean, he was really a together person, really, and can't believe it's 34 years since he died. And in a sense, I would say, Sam, he's more popular now than he was then.
Really?
Amongst
that was one of my questions. So you think now, with the benefit, of looking back on, footage from those days, and maybe the world we live in today, where you can sort of find out so much more quickly. Is that right? You think he's now sort of, people all of a sudden, there's a huge fondness for him now that maybe there wasn't when he was playing?
Well, yeah, that's true. Maybe people didn't understand, but also I think you can't discount the effect of let's say YouTube. Social media. I mean, anybody who finds out about George, who's interested in the golf swing or in George, can just go to YouTube and find all kinds of stuff about him. There's no end to it. I don't know if you know the golf instructor Bradley Hughes here, the Australian, and he was very successful on the Australian tour, and he played the PGA Tour a number of years, and then he turned to teaching. He teaches now in South Carolina. And I follow him pretty closely. BradleyHughesGolf.com. I'll put in a little plug for him. Why? Because he helped the PGA Tour player Brendan Todd win twice in a row a few years ago. Brendan was down in like the 1600s in the world ranking. But anyway, I learned through corresponding with Brad that he was a Knudson aficionado and had a lot to say about George. And Brad happened to tell me that he had written an analysis of the book, going through it page by page by page, word by word by word. So he was kind enough to send me a 9-page single-spaced document about the book and about George's golf swing and what he believed George was saying and how he feels it can be useful, even today, and how he's maybe incorporated some of it into his own teaching. And so George is very, very current amongst modern instructors, and I've never met anybody who didn't have a teacher. We didn't have a lot of respect for George.
You put it so beautifully as well, particularly when you were talking a few minutes ago about the consistency across his handwriting and everything like that, and the garden, the way he walked down the fairway, and then I think you said at the top of the pod, he was like a golfer's golfer. Like he's people who really get the purity of the sport. Get George, I think that's kind of what I'm hearing, and I can certainly see that. And it's interesting there hearing about Brad, and it's almost like he's created this Rosetta Stone for interpreting the sort of manuscripts and stuff that sit within the book. Obviously, he died in 1989. I think you did the eulogy at his funeral. Was that right?
I did,
Lorne?
yeah. Yeah.
I suppose you'd become quite close over that time, really, and
he was really one of my closest friends and supporters. Encouraged me, I mean, it was just a great friendship, and you hope you're not gonna have to do a eulogy for somebody when they're 51, but his family asked me to do it, and we had gotten that close, and I remember the church was just jammed. It was so full. I remember my dad came. My dad died later that year, a pretty young man himself, 66, but people came from all walks of life to hear George. He was so highly I would say, loved in Canada, really. And the church was standing room only, and it was quite a moment, really. We wish he'd lasted another 30 years, so golfers could have the benefit of his teaching and his enthusiasm. He was such a people person. When he got to know you and you got to know him, he just wanted people to enjoy golf better. If it wasn't golf, he wanted them to enjoy music better, or whatever. He wanted them to live with a passion. He said, you got one life here. Come on, don't be wasting it. Find something you really enjoy. And of course, for him and his world, it was mostly the golf swing, the golf game.
And I suppose one of the hard things to write, a prolific writer, but I can imagine that's not an easy thing to do, to write for a friend at the age of 51 who's passed. That's yeah. And I think, Lorne, huge thank you for joining this podcast and sharing some of this stuff about George. I learned so much through the process of that, and I think these podcasts are so much about trying to profile some of the more interesting players from across the game who maybe don't get the same airtime as whether it's Jack or Arnie or Tiger. And I think there's a fascination there with George Knudson, just as a character, as a player, his thoughts on the swing. Everything really. If people haven't already rushed out to buy a copy of The Natural Swing, which you co-authored with George, we would obviously highly recommend they do. Are there any other resources? I know you've done so many different pieces about George in things like McKellar and different publications. Where would you point people to? I mean, YouTube, just to see his swing, obviously.
Yeah, I would say certainly go online and check out, he did a video actually called The Natural Golf Swing. It was called The Swing Motion, because he believed golf is a motion. That's useful. And there are things you can find from CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, did a short piece on him, which is not that hard to find, in which they didn't interview George, but they interviewed his mother when up there. And she provides a lot of insights into, what kind of a kid he was, what kind of a son he was, and the love he had for the game then, and how he was very careful about when he had his meals, and he was very meticulous about how he was going to kind of organize every day. You can see it when she's talking about it.
Why was that? Because I saw that in one of the interviews, and says, George was really, very skinny as a child, but used to eat loads, and he had to eat at separate times. But I can't really understand why. So why was that?
Just something about him. I think, he didn't want his life to get out of hand. And I think he needed some order to it. And if he was going to play his best golf, even as a kid, and he won, Canadian Junior, so on and so forth. But, he just had to have things organized, orchestrated in a certain way. And that's what he found. And if he was thrown off, it could be a hard day for him, really. It's all of a sudden, he would have had a tough time now with phones. He would have kept his phone off all day. But even if he's looking at a couple times a day and somebody's saying, George, I need to reach you, I need to talk to you, he might say, you know what? Like, this has got to wait till next week. I'm busy this week. He wouldn't. I think he'd have a hard time with the way time is structured these days, because he wanted to do it his own way always. And I just think that was just part of his nature. That's part of what makes him interesting, really. That's part of what makes him such an intriguing study, to see what went into his creativity and his genius as a golfer, really.
Yeah. There's like a whole Zen thing about him, isn't there, really, I think, which kind of comes through in everything you brought to light.
He liked Japanese food more than anything. He had a favorite restaurant in Toronto. He loved Japan. He would go over to play there in a tournament that Gene Sarrazin was involved in, called the Jun, J-U-N. I guess it's a company there. I don't know if it still exists, but he loved going to Japan. He and his wife Shirley went there. That's where he hit his one perfect shot over there to that elevated green. But whenever we had 2 or 3 favorite Japanese restaurants in Toronto, we'd go out for lunch or dinner, and a couple of them all the time, with either on our own or with some friends. And there was just something about Japanese food and the whole Japanese culture that he liked, that he felt, maybe it was just that it was quiet and organized. At least he felt it was. And he was fascinated with Japanese culture.
But it's sort of meditative, isn't it? In so much as the rituals of, the different simple practices of daily life in Japan have this sort of meditative state that they try and bring through, whether it's, writing, there's a lot in the sort of ancient culture, I think, around that sort of stuff. And you can see how there would be perhaps some synergy with what he was looking for. Did you get anything more from him on this 5-iron in Japan? Because it's really weird. We have a a member at our club. He obviously not in the realms of George, but he's played really good amateur golf for many years. He's been scratch plus handicapper for ages, and he's a complex human being when he talks about the swing. He's obsessed with this idea that his trousers. He wanted to have trousers that you could pull a thing and it would lift the material away from the backs of your legs, so it would replicate the feeling of a right to left wind when you stand over the shot. He's crazy, but he actually, if you say to him, you talk to him about the shots, he'll say, I've only ever really hit one great shot in my career. Now, whether he's stolen that from something he read about George, but he's obsessed with this one shot he hit. Did George ever talk about that shot in Japan? The one great shot
he talked about that the green was very elevated, so he had to get the ball up high. And, he was kind of more of a low ball hitter, George, in those days, with the clubs that he used and so on. But now he had to suddenly hit the ball way up in the air with a 5 iron, I don't know, maybe 175 yards, something like that, and be an 8 iron today or a 9 iron. But anyway, but he talked about the ball just exploding off the face, and as it was taking off and rising and rising and rising, he would think, I could still feel the ball on the face, even though it was in the air. Because his club, he felt, extended so far down the line, longer than the shaft length towards the hole, right? Because that's what he meant. Golf is a game of motion directed towards a target. So there was something about that he felt everything just extended so far down the line towards the target before he finished on that front foot. And then he said the ball just soared and soared and soared, stayed in the air forever, and they just plopped down next to the hole. It was more of the feeling of it. Now, I don't know even if some of that feeling was, perhaps it was invented. Obviously the ball wasn't sticking to the face or anything as it was in the air.
No.
But that's how he felt. And he talked about it, like a poet, as if he were sitting in a jam session with a bunch of musicians. Somehow it all came together, they connected. I've been listening this week to a lot of Wayne Shorter music because he died the other day, and reading about him. That's the way he talked. And that's the way George talked about the swing as well, and particularly about that shot. Just all came together, and it was so unusual, you might say, as many good shots as he hit, that he just said, that's the best shot, the one perfect shot I ever hit. And he was always trying to approach that. You can't make it happen. It just happened. All of the conditions were right. The air, the thickness of the air, the way the green was, the shot that he had to hit with his body through the ball. Yeah, he could have probably written a dissertation on just that one shot.
The intensity is staggering. Lorne, that's been an amazing episode. I cannot thank you enough for finding the time. And like I say, hopefully it's not the last time you'll be on the podcast. Once again, thank you so much for joining and talking to us about your friend George. And yeah, I know I'm getting in the way of your tea time this afternoon, so I'm going to let you get out of here. But once again, many thanks.
Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.
Watch this.